Welcome everyone to NextGen HR, harnessing data to demonstrate strategic value and justify more budget. All right, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Christina Cook, the Director of Product Marketing at NEOGOV. I work at the intersection of our customers, our products, and marketing. Really excited to be here with you today. And Reed, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Reed Walsh. I am currently the Chief Human Resource Officer here at NEOGOV. So definitely, in the HR realm, doing HR every day. And prior to that, I spent 8 years at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, about 7 of which, maybe more like 6.8 of which, was as the Deputy Secretary for Human Resources and Management, which translates to the head of HR for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Just as context, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, when I was over it, went through a very large transition process and did centralization of all of our HR staff, and really gave me a trial by fire with data in particular, having such a large organization of about 72,000 employees. So happy to be here, happy to be with HR folks, and hopefully add some insight.
Great, thanks, Reed. And today's agenda, we're going to cover the importance of HR strategy and talk about the role of data in developing HR strategy. Then we're going to walk through some really practical framework for how to start gathering data and helping it contribute to your strategy, and quite a few different scenarios and use cases. And then finally, we're going to round it out with ways that you can start to change the conversation with your organization. How can you go about start justifying additional budget, additional resources, and all of that? So let's go ahead and dive in today. We're excited. So first off, why is strategy important? Well, the American Productivity and Quality Center recently did some benchmarking and found that top performing HR organizations spend 20% of their time on strategy, while the bottom performing organizations spend less than 10% of their time on strategy. I'd love to pause for a moment for the audience. We're going to launch a poll here in just a moment and kind of get a sense, reflect how much time are you actually spending on strategy? We'd love to hear from you on that. And Reed, I'd love your perspective on why is it easy not to spend time on strategy? What are the things kind of getting in the way of HR teams to be more strategic?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think there's just the daily tasks that you have in front of you, right? It's really easy to get caught up in the execution of things, especially when you're a leader or someone who's in a management position. You're helping employees and training employees through issues that they may be having. It's very easy to not be spending time on strategy. Also maybe a little hard to quantify, because sometimes you feel like you do a very large block of strategy, and then you sort of move into execution, kind of depending on your role. But it's a daily distractions. There's so much being asked of HR, and I doubled down on that, especially after the COVID pandemic. There's a lot of expectations to help solve problems, make people better employees, give everybody the right words to say in difficult conversations. So there's a lot under our umbrella, and normally as HR practitioners, we're wearing quite a few hats. So my trick was always making sure that I set aside time specifically for my time to focus on looking at numbers for execution. I didn't always do it well, but I would try to block off my calendar and be pretty fierce about reserving that time. But it's really, really difficult. And I saw another statistic, Christina, just a little diversion once, that said managers should spend, I think it was kind of a high performing manager spends X amount of time with the employees versus what they do in reality. I think it was like 30 they should be spending mentoring and counseling their employees, but what happens in reality is 9%, right? So I think all of our goals would just be to try to move it a little bit more in that direction.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at the results, see where our audience is at today. So it looks like, oh, this is great. We've got some folks in that 10 to 15%, but we definitely looks like we have a lot of opportunity to improve in this area. And as a manager myself, absolutely, it's so easy to get distracted in the execution. So thanks everyone for sharing the results here today. Let's talk a little bit, Reed. Just to make the case, why should we be all spending more time on strategy? no matter what level in the organization we are, and what's the importance, especially for these HR leaders on the line today.
Yeah, I think one of the bullet that stands out the most, and the one that I think is sort of first, is bringing focus to the organization, right? Because we know that we make choices every day about, because there's so much to get to, what are those top things that are really going to move the needle for our organization? So defining them, communicating them, it does all of these things, like creates cohesion, right? It aligns people across the organization. So as you're having these conversations where you tend to creep in scope, you can really go back to that focus. What are your focus? What's a strategy that you're trying to achieve? I think for the most part, I think a lot of people in this call are leaders in some capacity. And I think having that strategy and be able to bring that focus when things seem like they get a little out of control, and we feel a little chaotic, is a really important trait. Because if you're going to foster some sense of, this is what we do, this is the team that does it, those employees are also going to see you having the ability to do that upwards as well. So regardless of your position in the company, fostering that stability, it makes people relax a little bit more. They feel like, you as a manager, you as a leader, you as the head of HR, if you are, have that in hand. And definitely people stay more engaged, right? Nobody wants to feel chaotic. Nobody wants to feel like they have a million priorities, and so you're the master of none. And you're really not moving the needle for anything in a meaningful way. So it's key, and spending time on it is, sort of our obligation to, engage employees, because they're going to stick around longer. We all know how difficult turnover is.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk for a minute about the role of data. I don't want to read these. These are the more obvious reasons why data is important, right? It takes some of the emotion out of things. It moves things to being from more anecdotal to more objective. But looking beyond what's here on the slide, Reed, what are the other big benefits of incorporating data in our strategy and the role that it plays?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I was always thinking about as an HR leader is challenging my own personal assumptions. So I may be very well versed or be very well briefed on a certain situation. But when then I look at the data, either I realize, oh my goodness, this situation is actually a repeated pattern and maybe we need to address it. And or it brings things to light that I didn't know, right? So I think that helps you become more educated, generally, because sometimes we all know sort of the biggest issue in the room, because perhaps it's the loudest voice in the room, or perhaps something, hit the paper, is something you have to deal with, but it might not be the biggest problem, right? So I think data reveals a lot of what's an anomaly, what's an instance versus a pattern of things that you need to address as an organization. I also think, in order to influence anyone who's really having an engaged conversation with you, from, if you're engaging people upwards, will want to know why. And it's really important to have that empirical data, in addition to sort of the anecdotal data, the feelings in the room, to have a really productive conversation, to back up what you're trying to address. And I also think it gives you an ability to say, what's the scale? Like, how big is the problem, right? Like, is this a really big problem, or is this a little problem? Which also helps with the, setting the strategy for what you want to address first.
Yeah, absolutely. It can get easy to caught up in how everyone's feeling, and you realize, oh, this actually isn't the biggest problem that we're facing right now. So let's talk about where everyone today can start. This is just a starting point. I think there's almost limitless areas in your organization that you can start to analyze. But if you're, new to analyzing data and taking kind of leading up in some of these conversations, we recommend start by evaluating every single stage of your hiring funnel. Then move from, pre-hire to onboard, what's happening there. Then look at long-term engagement and development, tying learning with performance and all of that, and just continue through the life cycle. But the easiest place to start is going to be at the hiring funnel, and that's kind of where we're going to start today. Is there anything you'd like to add to this list, Reed?
Yeah, kind of as you were talking, I was thinking about the benefits of having data in places you don't really think about. And And some of that, especially in a large organization is, turnover and people leaving. We live in a different environment where people don't necessarily stay at jobs as long as they used to. I know in Pennsylvania, we made changes to our pension plan. And so therefore, sort of the talking points of why you would be a Commonwealth employee, changed a little bit. And frankly, our older managers sort of struggle with how do they sell us as an employer. But I think it gives you an ability to look at things that you wouldn't really think of. So benefits, right? So if we have a lot of people leaving, and we know they're of a certain age where they may be thinking about, a more established life, like what can we be proactively pushing to them in terms of benefits? You may be thinking about a job change. Let me tell you about why this is relevant to you at this point in your life, right? So, and other people you might be talking to differently. Like, for instance, if you know that you have a washout rate with your corrections officers that hits between like year 3 and 5, how do you pull that data? How are those employees performing? What do you need to stress? And how do you educate them on, what things will look like for them and, in years beyond that? So there's so many possibilities to do with this. I also think that you need to look for things outside your HR data. Different organizations in different states, counties, cities have different areas that may handle things like engagement surveys or pulse surveys or EMPS or anything like that. And I think that looks for a full picture. So make sure you're partnering with those people if it's not within your realm, because I do think that information is really important in addition to the empirical data that you may have within your systems in HR.
Yeah, that's a great reminder to look outside just your talent management systems and all of that. And also, I will say to anyone on the line, if you're still on paper, this is one good reason to consider some kind of electronic talent or, human capital management, because you're probably not able to pull a lot of this data that we're going to discuss today. But let's talk a little bit on how to get started. So we're going to present this framework. We're going to go through a couple of scenarios, and then Reed's going to share some real experiences and how she went about solving the problem. But this is just to get you started. So it doesn't matter what piece of data that you're analyzing, you can take this framework with you and it applies to everything. So first, asking yourself, what is the data telling me? But equally important, what is it not telling you? Oftentimes one data set or one report only tells you part of the story, which is why Reed just mentioned you need to bring in these other sources, bring in these other points. And two, why is it happening? Oftentimes, we may not know exactly why it's happening, but this is where we can, go back to science back in the day where we hypothesize. What are your hypotheses? What are the possible reasons this is happening? And then you kind of go to validate that. Well, how do I get more information to draw more clear conclusions? So how do I prove my hypothesis? Or how can I, if the why is really clear, how can I go about and improve this process? So we're going to walk through these different scenarios together and then share some examples. So let's take the example of time to hire year over year. And let's pretend in our fake HR organization that we found our time to hire has been increasing for the past 2 years. Well, why? We think it's because we're getting fewer qualified applicants. And we also think it might also be tied, we have a lot of new hiring managers and they don't necessarily all understand the process in the same way. So it's a lot of time spent just kind of explaining the process to them. So how can we validate these different hypotheses? Well, what's our application volume year over year? Maybe it's an issue of not enough applicants. Were there changes in how we screen our candidates? Maybe our qualifications are too high, and that's why we're getting fewer qualified. Another, are the hiring managers getting the training that they need to be able to help candidates move through the process? So Reed, tell us about a time maybe you were struggling with time to hire. How'd you go about uncovering the problem, and then what'd you do to kind of implement a change within your organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think time to hire is always a pressure point for HR, right? And I think as HR practitioners, we would certainly like there to be as much emphasis on quality of candidate, quality of interview, quality of evaluation as there is time to hire. But the reality is, time to hire is a big deal. When you're talking about breaking the hiring cycle down piece by piece, I think that was a really important part of how we were trying to diagnose what was happening in that hiring process, because hiring is not just HR. So when you look at your time to hire, what's happening with how long is it taking you to get what you would consider to be a healthy pool of candidates, right? So are people looking at that and applying? Where are those handoffs happening between applicant, hiring manager, HR, so that you can really diagnose what the issues were? We went through a decent amount of changes in the Commonwealth, sort of over the course of my 6.5 years, some of them to greater success than others, one of which was doing a lot of consolidation. So we thought, let's make sure that we're consolidating units so that the people are doing background checks, they can do the background checks and they're going to go through them, and sort of doing a little bit of that specialized model. So when we did all these changes, and at that point we had Christina, a well-established, we really parceled out those steps in the process. And because of that, we went through a significant increase in our time to hire. And we're like, what is happening? Where is this happening? And it did not take long for us to diagnose that our background check unit was just overwhelmed. They had way too much coming in, due to how we did the project or catch-up work we were doing. And so we had to shift resources, right? So it wasn't that anything, we didn't feel that we had a huge training issue. It was pure like, here's the amount of people that we have, here are the hours in the day that we have assigned to meet the demand, and so how do we adjust that? So, I really think there's a lot of things that can be diagnosed. It could be resource assignment. It could be, how are you writing that job description that people are like, yeah, no thanks, and they're not even going through the process. And how much are you thinking about what's the behavior, right? So I think we're all seeing different behavior in applicants, and how much of our strategy do we need to put into keeping applicants engaged? They hit our system once, how are we going to keep them and they don't go through the process anymore, but how do we keep them reminded of us as an employer, and in particular an employer of choice? So lots of possibility there, and definitely having that information helps you be more nimble.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Reed. That's a great example. For our next scenario, we'll kind of walk through application volume year over year. So in our fake example, the application volume is going down year over year for hard to fill roles. This is actually something we're hearing from a lot of our customers right now. So I didn't completely make this up because we're hearing it time and time again. And why? Well, it seems like, especially like in public safety and stuff, candidates don't seem interested in public sector jobs. There has been some government level data showing there is a drop in folks, looking to go into the public sector. So that's one hypothesis. So what can we look at to, further validate this and look at things that are actually within our realm of control? Well, are your salaries competitive? I know NEOGOV has a salary comparison tool that you can look at. So are you looking around your surrounding, counties and cities? Are you competitive with them? Are your job descriptions appealing? Are they confusing? Sometimes it's helpful to take private sector job descriptions and apply them to the public sector because they may not translate with the public sector descriptions may not translate if you're trying to recruit from the private sector. And what about proactive outreach? Are you doing anything proactive, or are you just sitting back hoping that folks apply? These are some things that you could start to dig into and look at. And Reed, love to hear from you. When did you run into this in your experience with when application volume dipped? How did you diagnose, and then how did you go about implementing a solution?
Yeah, first I'll say that I think one of the most interesting, engaging reports that, I ever kind of looked at with my team was how many people were applying, how many were getting through the funnel, and how many ultimately were chosen by the manager. And it told stories that we did not expect, So, we had, I remember one instance in our Department of Conservation and Natural Resources in our Parks and Rec area. And I can't remember exactly if it was an entry-level position or if it was a trainee course. And we were trying to get more young people engaged, in being parks employees, especially in places where we had, parks in downtown Philadelphia, where people have been thinking about us as an employer, thinking about the ability to do that type of work. And, one of the things that we, had conversations about is we can recruit all that we want to, we can, do all these things, but look at what's happening. Like, look at how many people are applying and being turned away. And we, pulled back the layer on it. It was because of this kind of science requirement, right, for the job. So it forces you to reframe the thinking. Like, maybe there were fuller pools back then. Maybe there were more people interested in studying that. But right now we're not getting it. So how do we think about that one requirement that seems to be the thing that's turning people off? How do we either bring people in and support them through that educational journey, and that's going to, open up our doors and achieve the goals we want to do of getting more people to be interested in working in our state parks. So that was really, a compelling statistic to look at in terms of the data and opening the conversation to the other things that it could be beyond just like, well, they're not getting through the funnel. Well, okay, so what's within that? Another thing that I think about is, especially in larger, larger public sector entities, you tend to have a lot of competition amongst each other. So we were feeling the nursing shortage, and this is before COVID occurred. So, COVID was something we never expected, and we were feeling a lot of nursing shortages. So we made a concerted effort, because it's not just about being safe. When I talk to like my colleagues at the Department of Veterans Affairs, it wasn't just about like being safe and meeting the percentages. Like that was a big deal, but also the more people we get to work in these homes, the more we can increase our service to that population. So we were limiting our ability to serve the people that needed it because we couldn't hire enough nurses, let alone staff the ones that we already have and keep the patient ratios where they should be. So that was one of the time where we use like clear data on the nurses not coming in to think about what data we didn't have, why aren't they coming in, right? So looking at all the things, where are we in comparison to our competitors when it comes to scheduling? Where are we in comparison when it comes to salaries? What are we doing within our own agencies or our own departments to have a more cohesive strategy and have people who are interested in the healthcare field look at the Commonwealth generally, that may or may not be applicable for all your environments that you work in, but a lot of cohesion. And from that, we got outside data, compared it to our inside data, and made some very strategic choices about how we were going to do shifts, what we were going to be paying our folks, how to even out things in our environment. And I can tell you with certainty that we were hiring nurses at a higher rate than we ever were, and we did it all through COVID, despite everything that's going on with COVID. So that data really helped us to figure out what our focal point was going to be, and then hit the goals.
That's incredible, because I know during COVID, hiring for nurses was very, very challenging for a lot of folks. So that sounds like a huge achievement for your agency. Let's move on to application conversion rate by stage. This is another great metric, when you're looking at your hiring funnel. So let's say in our hypothetical scenario, there's a big drop off between the screening process and the first interview with the hiring manager. Well, our hypothesis is, well, most of the applicants don't have the qualifications we're looking for. And this actually ties well to your last story, Reed, about the science degree.
Yeah.
And then, so well, is there a shortage in the market of candidates with these skills? Are there even enough new grads getting science degrees to, meet this Parks and Rec need? Are the qualifications unrealistic based on the salary? We're kind of in a different realm now where it's the candidates kind of in charge more so than ever before. Or, do you need to provide an apprentices or training program to bring people in and build a pipeline yourself? So Reed, talk to us. Yeah, do you have some examples to share around this as well, the conversion rate?
Yeah, and I think, some of the examples, like you said, with, already kind of exemplified this, but I think the beauty of this, the beauty of having that data about the drop off in the screening process is that it creates the conversation, right? So it allows you to really dig into the why. It gives you a guiding principle for having those conversations and talking about it. And maybe even going back and collecting more data, saying, okay, yeah, we don't collect that now, but maybe we should be putting this into our process so we can measure it. I think that's just, there's such relief in being able to have those conversations and not just kind of get in the room with no data and say, okay, we got a problem here. One of the things I think about is, I'm sure a lot of you were dealing with unemployment compensation and the crush that we were under for unemployment compensation generally. Again, doubled down with COVID, all the new types, and it was just something that no organization could manage, because it was just incredible. But of course, it put a focus on unemployment compensation areas, and I remember us having a lot of conversations about salary, a lot of conversations about recruiting, a lot of conversations about reviewing people faster and getting them to the hiring managers faster, and all of those things were important. But as we were looking at the data, and we also did some changing to some classifications and that sort of thing, but one of the things that we realized through the data is we really have fairly full candidate pools, especially for some of our UC centers. And we also realized that we weren't necessarily assigning the work by area, right? So we didn't have to be bound by that. So there were other problems that were within the agency, in addition to some of the stuff we did on the hiring side, but one of them being they were kind of pushing candidates away because they just didn't have enough space or trainers or whatever to make sure people got up to speed on how to do the actual work. So I think the conversation there was about investment, right? Limited amount of resources. So are we investing time on the front end, or do we feel like that's already in pretty good shape? And actually, there's this problem over here that's about 4 steps down that's really affected our ability to hire these classes of people. And that's what we found. We would have these really full applicant pools, people who qualified for the job, and we'd be turning people away who wanted to have that work, because God bless you. And because of these other internal issues having to do with shifting resources to training, or space, or maybe even open you up to remote work if you can't physically fit everyone in the building. So a lot of good things are revealed that can really help you move the needle, because at the end of the day, the litmus test is how many people are getting that service.
Yeah, great. Great examples, Reed. Thank you. So let's transition a bit. Like, how can all our listeners today, they've gotten the data. Now, what's that kind of next step to take to their leadership to ask for those more resources? Reed, can you kind of walk us through steps to make the case for our audience here today?
Yeah, sure. And the first at worst is let's start with the data. Some of you may be a little bit less mature in that and start to build your data game. So, my suggestion would be to, get the trusted workers in the room who know this stuff and say, what problems are we trying to solve? What do we have? What do we not have? Just a reiteration of some of the stuff that Christina said earlier. So subjective and objective data points, hiring manager feedback, applicant feedback, all of that's going to be critical because they are the people that are in it every day. The hiring manager feedback, I think, is great. Like if we see like a hiring manager seems to be taking a really long time to do these interviews and they seem to be dragging their feet, maybe there's something there. Again, they're not quite sure how to sell the organization. We have managers that have been there for 30 years and things have changed a little bit. The motivations are different. They just feel kind of uneasy doing that. So how do we address that and, and help them through that? And then definitely applicant volume, benchmarks. We used to be doing well here, and then maybe we made this change to the application, or that was successful or that wasn't successful. So I think just having a very strong understanding of the data, asking yourself those questions before you're going into the room with everybody. If I'm sitting across the table from somebody, what questions are they going to ask me, and how am I going to answer them? Sometimes I don't have that data point is a great question. Sometimes it's I don't have that data point, and unless I do, this is not going to be a productive conversation, right? So I think really testing yourself on that is really important. What story is the data telling you? Do you have the data that is going to really solve the problem, or just the data that reveals a portion of the problem that you want to solve, or that sort of thing? So making sure you have like really authentic, hygienic data that really tells the whole story, and then saying, okay, what is this telling us? And then how do these problems fit into our strategic plan, right? If we're hearing, whatever the scenario may be, and you look at that problem and you look at the resources to solve that problem, and you go back to your plan and say, that's a problem, but that is not the biggest fish we're dealing with. So we're going to acknowledge this. We're going to keep that data in reserve until we focus on these other things. So again, like bringing that cohesion back. We all have busy leaders, or we are busy leaders. So you want the things to be put in front of you that are actionable and that adhere to the strategic plan that you have for your organization. And then, always connect the strategic plan to the risk of failure. I found that people are really motivated, and I think Christina, we had this conversation. People are really motivated by some of the tasks that they may be able to, I don't want to say get rid of, but that are not a great use of their time. So if you think about data and time to hire or getting like someone in the seat, I remember when I was working for the Commonwealth, we had a fairly sophisticated HR service center, right? But our systems weren't talking very well, so we did a lot of rekeying. So we were going to ask the employees to engage in a project where they were going to basically build a bot, train the bot. So taking time away from their work they know very well to something that they're like, I don't know how to program a bot. I don't know how to do that, you know, but understanding like, hey guys, this is going to be awesome because you're going to try this. And if it works, great. Look at this rekeying you're not going to have to do. You guys are the experts and do it. And if we try it, it doesn't work, you know, you learned a new skill and you had a bot named Rosie, which is actually the name they gave to the bot. You know, so I think that, you know, it's really important as you're doing these things to also remember what the motivations are for people, you know, in terms of kind of like buying into the plan. So always thinking about the person and the work that they're doing and how you're making them a more essential part of your organization, you know, as you're looking at those things that you can make the case to change.
Yeah, I actually heard a great story from one of our customers. One of the ways they were able to get funding for software is they went to the HR leader and said, did you realize your team is inputting the same data in 4 different systems?
Right.
And the HR leader knew that the work was getting done, but didn't recognize that it was just required so much manual work. And then obviously, and they were concerned, okay, that's risk of error and all of that. And that was
Sure.
one of the things that helped motivated the change. Is kind of the risk was motivating the change versus the more positive spin, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. The risk, the relief people will feel when you know, when you relieve them of some of that, and also there's always pressure for we just don't have enough people to do all this work, you know, and how do you, as a leader, look at that strategically? Is okay, so what is my investment in this technology? How many people do I currently have doing this? How much time are they spending on that? And where do I see us hit that place where we're going to free up their time enough where I'm not going to have to hire those 4 additional people, or, you know, whatever it may be. And doing those sort of calculations are really, really important, and will give you a sense, I think as an HR professional, will give you a sense that you're really making good decisions for the organization, that you're making good, healthy decisions. You know, there's always going to be a time where you're kind of, you know, feeling the decision, and then you see the fruits of the decision come into play, and understanding what that trajectory is going to be, you know, really gives you a sense of selling it to people, and also that, again, wise decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of good ground today. Let's have some like closing takeaways for our audience today, Reed, just to kind of get everyone here excited to go back, dig into the data, go ask for more resources or technology or whatever it
Yeah,
is they're looking
yeah.
to accomplish. Yeah, what can we send them off with? And then we'll have some resources and things we'll discuss afterwards. But yeah, go ahead, Reed.
Yeah, I definitely think, you know, you're the first point here, leveraging the software beyond the functional. So there's probably a lot more within your, if you have software, or even if you use Excel, there's a lot more than probably you know that you can do within that. So really understanding the full scope of things that you have access to as you're using technology is really, really important. When I came into the Commonwealth, and again, there were so many wonderful people that I work with that had fabulous ideas. My goal was to, you know, tear down the hurdles, but we weren't using our applicant tracking software to the extent that we could have, right? There were so many things we could have been doing with it. In fact, we were in a system where we had people applying to a completely different website if they were civil service. And so, you know, to be able to understand that that technology could do the same thing that we were using for that 70% could do the same thing for everybody else. And then the data that we would get to leverage from that was huge. But we were just small things, like we weren't, you know, we had the ability to put images and videos in that maybe would be a little bit more catchy for people, and it just wasn't being done, right? So again, like, how do you prioritize those things and understand what you can do? Talking to your peers is huge, right? You know, any conference I can go to, in fact, I'm sort of like missing that peer connection, you know, being in NEOGOV now, and used to have monthly calls with some other state leaders, and boy, do I miss that, because that just, you know, you get a lot of good ideas. You know, again, like being, we're more motivated by pain avoidance, than a better way. What are those pain points and how do we solve them? What works for your specific environment? You all know what those things are that you need to solve, how you're going to be able to sell people on it. So what are those things you really need to lean into with technology that's going to be the game changer for you, that's going to be the lever to produce great change? Flip the script. You may realize there's some capability with either from data or capability within your technology that's going to completely have you look at something in a different way, and think big but start small, right? So like if I think about mapping out the time to hire, even just the decisions on, okay, what portions of this do we want to measure? There were lots of right answers, and so give yourself the ability to be nimble and be iterative in your decision-making process, but you really have to start with some of that really basic stuff. Okay, the conversation of where are our handoffs, where are we going to mark them, then how do we do that? And the next thing you're 6 years down the road and you have time to hire data that you can slice and dice in every way imaginable for your entire organization. So look at that end goal, if we just take time to hire as the example, and think about those pretty tedious, first 3 steps that you need to get through and decide on in order to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Reed. These are good suggestions. We want to let the audience know, if you're not a customer of NEOGOV, we're going to be sending you after this webinar the recording, but also a great report on 6 critical recruiting metrics that you should measure. It'll have a lot of good information and data in there that you can start exploring. For our customers on the line today, we're really excited. We're going to send you an introductory guide to analytics and reporting. It's going to be a step-by-step how to build all the reports we discussed today, plus some. So how to build a application volume year-over-year report, how to build the cost per hire report, all this stuff. So lots of goodies in there. And also, if you're a customer, if you were on the fence about Ignite, we have a lot of great content and topics on, getting buy-in, reporting, data. So these sessions, if you're already signed up to attend, highly recommend that you sign up for them. If you're not signed up for Ignite, just throw this up here real quick. You can get more information. We'd love to see you there. I'll be there speaking. Reed will be there speaking as well. It'll be a lot of fun. So we can talk more about data in person, which will be really exciting. So let's move to the Q&A. I'll keep this up. We already have some great questions, Reed. So I'll defer to you here as the expert. So are there any data points or suggestions to pull data related to hits on a job posting and the reason individuals do not apply? Where would you start?
Yeah, I think you have to look at the capability of your tool, so, do you have the ability to get the hits? Do you understand where they're coming from? Can you track that? Are you sending follow-up surveys? People come into our system, they're entering their email addresses. Are you saying, hey, we saw you didn't finish this, let us know why? Some of that stuff is really powerful information to have, so I think looking at the tools that you use, there's probably not very many applicant tracking systems that aren't going to give you that capability. How many people are hitting? Where are they coming from? And the ability to stay in touch with them is a very big deal. So I would definitely look into that. Like, what are your capabilities? Do you have them? Do you not have them? Who's in charge of it? And if nobody's in charge of it, who are you going to put in charge of that? Because it's really good information to have.
Yeah, and I'll throw in another suggestion there. As a product marketer, walk yourself through the application process. What is it like? Kind of put yourself, one of the big parts in the role that I play here is having empathy for the experience, of our customers. In this case, the applicants are your customer. What is it like for them to go and apply for a job for you and get a sense of that experience? What did you like? What did you not like? So I'd also add that.
Yeah, it does take a little bit of effort to get some of this feedback. And, the good thing is we know who our new hires are, right? So how do we get some donuts and try to get them into a room if you're in person or a virtual room to, have a conversation with us, about that. We actually did, when I was in the Commonwealth, this was not my idea, but boy, did I love it. we took some college students at a local Penn State campus and had them go through our applicant tracking process and literally watch them from behind the glass as they went through it, as they discussed it. The university was really anxious to partner with us on that, and it gave us so much information about what was working or not working. Obviously, that's an extreme way to do that. We are really trying to drive home the fact that our application process was fairly broken and we needed to make some changes. But there are lots of ways to do that. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. You can even just grab an employee that you just hired. Hey, you just went through it. What did you think? You know, or you could have done, you know, they're not going to walk up to you and say, hey, I just went through the application process. I'm really glad to be here, but you probably could have done this better. So ask them, engage them. You have resources right within your own ranks.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got another question. For someone who's still working with manual processes, maybe doesn't have a software or tool, where would you suggest they start if they only have a small budget to make change with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with what are our top priorities, right? Like, what are the things that are really killing us from a resource perspective, or it's unmanageable, or you know, whatever the case may be. So, what are your top risks? So, start with those, right? And then start having conversations. Have conversations with your peers. You know, have conversations with the vendor community. Of course, the vendor community, you know, has an end goal, but at the same time, like, you're not going to have exposure to these things if you don't get out there and ask, right? Like, how many times are we like deleting those emails that come in? Yeah, and sometimes it's, you know, you need to do that, especially if you're all set, you know, no thank you. But in particular, focus on your biggest problems, understand what tools are out there through conversation, through your own research, through meetings, and then look at your budget. Okay, so okay, I can't do anything within that. Can I do one phase of this? How do I work with the vendor? You know, is there a way that we can grow into this contract? You know, there's lots of possibilities. So, you know, my advice is just being really honest. Like, this is my problem. This is what I have to fix it. What can we do together? That's a great conversation to have.
Absolutely. And I've never been in a role where we didn't have constraints. We're all always going to have constraints, and we have to figure out what can we do within those constraints. Absolutely. We have a question around like average cost savings. We can follow up on that we'll follow up on that afterwards to get more specific information. I can't answer offhand, but maybe
I can give an example
share.
if you want to hear it,
Okay.
Christina. Okay.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah, so I mentioned before that we went through the process of having two different staffs working on applications, one that was civil service and one that was non-civil service. Our breakdown was 70% civil service over here, so the majority of applications being done in a different agency, the civil service agency, and 30% here, right? So we moved staff through legislation over to do that. All told, I looked at the talent management bucket across. After we did that move, after we settled into the system, we saved $2.5 million in personnel overhead. That happened through attrition.
Wow.
We didn't get rid of anybody, but there were huge savings. We're a big environment. So, but I mean, and you know, and frankly, the thing that I was most happy about was that means that we had to bill less to the agencies because we billed out to our agencies, right? So any savings I got from that was like, ching, I'm so glad. That's good for the taxpayer, that's good for everybody. And it's less cost, you know, which I had to pass off to the agencies to pay their bills. So I can tell you from, you know, doing some of those things, putting us into one system, not having IT to support two systems, not, you know, whatever the case may be. You know, I remember at some point the technology was so old, we were flying somebody in from Florida to service the technology that the civil service was on. So, you know, I think there's a lot of savings that can be quantified, and certainly some general guidelines, you know, that vendors can help with when you're looking at making those technology changes. And then again, talk to your peers. They're going to be able to do it. If you're starting to engage in a project, get all the costs that you want to say you move the needle on, make sure you have them now before you get into it. And then you can look at it, you know, 1 year down the road, 2 years down the road, and validate. But it's really important to think now about grabbing that data so that you can do that comparison later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add, oftentimes we don't measure the time we're spending on low value tasks, right? So if right now someone has to enter something in 4 different systems, well, how much does that add up to in a year? And you're paying them X dollars, and that can kind of be a
Yep.
calculation. And those resources can go to higher value things throughout your organization. So think about some of those manual things. If you pay people overtime to do certain things, I think it does have to be a bit organization specific, but we'll follow up with you specifically on some other key metrics there. One last question, unless another one comes in, but what would you say to someone, they're trying to lead up, they've gone to their boss with the data, but they're still not moving the needle and kind of making the case? What advice would you give that person on the line today?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that it's not always going to land, right? Like you're not, there's, I'm sure you've all had experiences where you were really prepared for a meeting, you had all the points that you wanted to say, whether they were data points or, something else, and it just didn't land. The room wasn't ready for it. There wasn't an appetite for it. It probably gives you an idea of the appetite for the situation, but it made you more educated on your organization. So there's, in my mind, there's nothing about analyzing that data that's not going to help you be a better employee, you be more informed, you challenge your assumptions about what's really affecting productivity in your organization. So, I would just say stay with it, because at some point it will land. And Christina, there's one more thing I want to talk about that I'll talk about briefly, is the ability to give clients data. So I think when we had our time to hire done and it was done well, we gave clients the ability to go in there and look at it in a self-service dashboard. And, that really made a big difference, because they really stayed engaged. It helps them cut down on some of that anecdotal information. And they were more advised consumers, the hiring managers and the people that were over those areas were more well-educated consumers of what was going on in their environment instead of the loudest voice in the room. So, I really encourage, like, once you're comfortable with it, making that data open to your hiring managers and other folks that they can self-service it. That was a big thing for us, and I think people appreciated that transparency.
Yeah, and I would also say it helps position the HR as a more strategic,
Sure.
arm of the organization, and helps encourage folks to look to you to be that person to solve some of these big problems versus just as an executor and all of that. Just
Sure. Absolutely.
absolutely. So thank you, Reed. Enjoyed the conversation today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Of course, we're going to follow up with all these great resources. If any of you are at Ignite, you can flag myself or Reed down. We'd love to meet you in person.
Absolutely.
Hope everyone has a fantastic day. Thank you all.
Nice to be here. Thank you.